Lynched on CTV, proudly brought to you by Christchurch's #1 dining offer, Sequoia 88 at the Redwood Hotel, a food concept unequalled. Good evening. Political veteran Winston Peters is showing no signs of retiring as he prepares to fight out yet another campaign. His party celebrated its 21st anniversary over the weekend, and he's announced a range of policies he believes will swing voters. Tonight, Winston Peters is my guest, and Lynched starts right now. Welcome to the program. It's common sense. That's the message New Zealand First is sending out to voters this election. Leader Winston Peters unveiled the party's slogan at a pre-election conference in Auckland yesterday afternoon. He's also announced a range of policies, including removing GST from household groceries, introducing tax incentives for research and development, and plans to clamp down on New Zealand's binge drinking culture. Winston Peters joins me, and good evening to you, sir.
Good evening.
Thanks for your time tonight. Common sense is the party's slogan from yesterday. Aren't you stealing Peter Dunn's slogan? He used to always talk about common sense policies.
Nobody remembers that.
Well, I did.
No, you don't.
And I remember the good old worm.
Somebody's misinformed you.
Anyway, I want to concentrate on local government because you're one of a selected few parties that actually has a local government policy, and I think that's really important to start with, particularly in Christchurch. You've said, and I quote, that New Zealand First will ensure local communities get a choice and not have amalgamations rammed down their throat by central government. Although Christchurch doesn't face that, we do face an organisation called SERA. Labour wants to get rid of SERA. What does New Zealand First want to do?
Well, look, no one wants to come floating into Christchurch and start telling local people what the problem is. But as a person who's observed it for some time, there is a serious lack of urgency here. And given the sacrifices and suffering of people, you have to wonder why. So whatever institutions are running this, and including the Minister, Jerry Brownlee himself, I think they just haven't grasped how critical the repair and the remedial effort that needs to go in behind this is, because I don't see them working 24/7.
Well, the fact is the matter, they're not.
Well, in a crisis like this, that's what should have been going on, night and day, 24/7. Japan, for example, roads and all sorts of things have been rebuilt post tsunami, and here we're going on sort of ordinary 5 days a week, maybe 6 days a week for some, but we just, I don't think, are making the effort to fix people's lives up as fast as possible and with sound compensation. Too many arguments with various institutions like insurance companies, and then you have lead agencies like Fletcher's. Why on earth did that happen? So that one outfit gets to decide all the contracts.
That's right, and in a way it's a monopoly, isn't it?
Well, it's not even a monopoly that got there by business acumen. They were positioned there by the government. Why are they clipping their ticket?
You raised serious concerns about potential fraud in Christchurch City about a year ago. Do those concerns, are they still relevant today, Mr. Peters?
They're as relevant as they ever were, and you're going to see this burst out on this, in the newspapers and on television in a matter of days.
Why? Why is it still relevant?
Because people
What's
are out
happening?
there robbing some people blind, cheating the system, cheating all manner of people who need contracts done, and also cheating the workforce that they have brought in. So it's a serious issue, and they need to be exposed.
Is it going to be easy to expose them given the amount of people working on this rebuild? As Third Degree exposed a week ago, we've got Filipino workers probably getting the runaround in the city. We've got people being underpaid. We've got tradesmen that don't seem to be able to do the job competently. On my talkback show, many people call up all the time saying the level of care taken to rebuild their home is nothing more than crap.
That's right. Well, you say, what does it take? Well, everybody's too scared of being sued. And I'm not criticising the media, but they're too scared of being hit by them as well. So we'll ensure the truth gets out regardless of that.
How will you do that, though? Parliamentary privilege?
Well, it's the proper use of parliamentary privilege. It's the proper use of a 400-year-old institution. And behind that is getting the truth out. It's not an abuse of parliamentary privilege to say this person is a crook and I'm going to prove it.
You think SERA has acted far too slow. And I agree with you there. So how the hell could we make them act faster? Because at the moment they started with about 55 employees. It's now ballooned to something like 300. Don't quote me on that figure, but it seems completely unnecessary. They keep filing out public relations, glossy magazines saying everything's fine. They spent about $500,000 on that in the last financial year. This was an agency that was supposed to help recover Christchurch, not be the government spin. But many people believe this agency is nothing more than a government spin agency, and that's a real concern to everyday Christchurch residents, I suspect.
Well, that's a fair suspicion. We asked to be briefed by Sarah. We're sitting in the room, this is going way back, and in walks Jerry Brownlee, the minister. And my thought was, well, why are you here, Jerry? I didn't ask this for you to brief me, I asked this agency to brief me. Now you're sitting here. What's going on? Now that tells me that the proximity between them, acting independently as the best civil servants, in this case, that they should be, has an overlay of even sliding into bullying from the minister. And certainly a number of claimants down here for justice and fairness are being bullied by a minister, prepared to spend millions in court cases and not millions on fairness and justice in their case.
I want to discuss that because it does seem really unfair that the Prime Minister said, with the greatest respect to the Prime Minister, that no one will be worse off after the earthquakes. But it makes me angry to think we still have residents in this city that are having to go through the court process, that are having to go through the legal system. You've met some Red Zone people this morning, you've met the Quake Artcast group. I know some of the issues are before the courts, but what are they telling you?
Well, the Prime Minister's statement wasn't worth the air it passed on, because these people are being offered half or less of what their property is actually worth. And on the basis of valuations that Mr. Brownlee and others have just plucked out of mid-air. It's not accurate, it's not fair. And what's the cost? I think, by our best estimate, about $18 million for fairness here in Christchurch. Maybe a bit more, maybe a bit less. They've spent 4 times that on NovaPay, the disaster to do with paying teachers, and it's still not working. Anybody been fired there? Look, they spent $800 million in the blowout on South Canterbury Finance. That is, they never capped the underwriting by the government of that finance company's operations. It blew out by $800 million, and they wouldn't have an inquiry as to find out who was the incompetent civil service or minister who didn't have the sense to put a cap on it.
You see, the government would claim, Jerry Brownlee would claim, they're trying to be financially prudent and they can't simply go giving out money to flatland owners, for example, because they're lucky to get any money given the fact that they can't insure bare land that hasn't been built on. The sad thing about that is if you dig a hole in that ground, you're fully insured. That seems unfair. Do you think the government has acted fast enough when it comes to insurance issues, when it comes down to saying to people like Southern Response, you pay out, you've got this amount of time to get the deadline right, if you don't, we're going to penalise you?
How much money has Southern Response got in government bonds?
A lot.
A lot of money, exactly. And that's propping up the government's so-called books and assets value that went into the last budget. Why would that be the case? I thought it was set up to help the people of Christchurch. Now, that's a pretty good issue and a pretty good question. But with Mr. Brownlee making that statement, I don't know what precedent he's trying to set, but what he's saying to people who are entitled to 100% compensation, in our view, that he arbitrarily thinks they should only get half, and be happy about that. That is the issue that we have to be concerned about. I think, with the great respect to Jerry, he should stick to what he knows, and this is in this area of the law, or of the valuation of property, or for that matter of real estate, is something he knows nothing about.
We need to take a break. When we return, will removing GST from groceries swing more voters New Zealand First's way? That's next. Stay with us. Welcome back to Lynched on CTV. My guest tonight is New Zealand First leader Winston Peters. Mr. Peters, you've said you want to scrap GST on food. What sort of food are we talking about? Pies?
No, look, the kind of items that people go into a supermarket for a family to buy, and that is food. And we'll take GST off your food, is what we're saying. Now, look, behind it, you've got serious poverty in this country now. And there's a trend where people are ignoring something that, 10, 15 years ago they'd have been alarmed at. Now we've got, they say, 250,000 young children who are living in poverty. Now that's an appalling figure. Say they're half wrong. and it's only 125,000. It is still a disastrous figure for a country like ours that used to be number 2 in the world in income per capita.
It still amazes me
that's how far we've fallen.
It still amazes me that a bottle of Coke is cheaper than a bottle of milk in this country when we have a company like Fonterra. So how are you going to afford this though? It sounds great. It sounds really good. I think GST off healthy food is going to help.
It doesn't sound great, it is great.
Well, how are you going to pay for it?
Well, look, we need a circuit breaker against poverty, and we are saying in New Zealand First, this is a circuit breaker. How are we going to pay for it? Well, that's amazing. The National Party found $5 billion for its mates at the top end of the tax rate, and they have the effrontery to look at me like you are and saying, how are we going to pay for it? They just showed you one way of paying for it, but this is the real point. We have about $7 billion plus of tax evasion and the black market and the black market every year. We want to deal to that and ensure that we all pay our taxes fairly. You pay your tax, I pay mine, so should everybody else.
So does that mean you're going to have to beef up the resources for the IRD, for the police? How are you going to do it then?
Well, for a start, you're talking about the police. Well, the last time we had a chance to beef up the resources, there was the biggest increase in the police force this country's ever had. 1,000 extra frontline police between 2005 and 2008, and 235 back office staff. Since then, the numbers have fallen away. Since then, the government claims that crime is falling. We know that's not true.
So, but you will have to put obviously more resources into a number of...
For every person you put on tax evasion in IRD, your return could be as high as 7 to 1.
Just give me a couple of examples of the sort of food you're talking about, GST. I mean, what kind of food are we talking about? Are we talking about just the basics,
milk,
milk?
Bread, milk, meat, fish, the things that, you know, people need. If, for example, if it's a pizza base, of course it'll be off. If you want to go downtown and from takeaway...
Pizza base.
If you want to go downtown and buy a pizza to takeaway, no, it won't be on that. GST will stay on that. Or, for example, pies from takeaways. But if you go to the supermarket and buy the pie and you regard it as your food, of course it'll be off that in the supermarket.
You see... It sounds so well intended.
Australia's got it.
Really work?
The UK's got it. Australia's far too complex because Australia has what they call basic food, and that's where the argument starts. So we've said all food, right? And your food, the kind of food that you could say 95% of the homes in this country buy as basics. The UK's got it. Countless countries have got this. And so those people who say, oh, it's complicated. Well, with the greatest respect, I see them happily going overseas, going to supermarkets, staying there for a while, all living under a system where GST is exempt, and so it should be exempt here.
We have such a great dairy and we have a great dairy industry, great meat industry.
Yes.
But I'm constantly amazed that our food is so much more expensive here than it is in Australia. Instead of the GST off food, why not look at companies like Fonterra? Why not look at the farming industry and think, well, what is going on here? Because I know there have been many reports to suggest there's nothing corrupt about the fact the price of milk is so expensive in New Zealand, but it still doesn't seem right when a price of milk is still more expensive than a bottle of Coke. I don't understand how that can be when we have one of the biggest dairy industries per capita in the world. Do you?
Well, here's the point. It is corrupt. The costings that they are putting into the supermarkets and telling you it's all fine is a world commodity price. It's not a New Zealand price. I mean, if I'm in Saudi Arabia, I don't pay world commodity prices for fuel and energy and gas, do I? There should be a commodity price for New Zealanders for logs. That is a timber price for New Zealand, so manufacturing and, for example, sawmills and all these people can stay in business. There should be a New Zealand price for milk. After all, we are the people that are the world leaders in it. One of the problems with dairying in this country is that far too much of its product is lowest common denominator. We should be the world's leader in infant formula, high added value. But where was the drive to get there? And now it's being seriously compromised in the Chinese market, and we are losing it, and down goes the price. Now, we've made a lot of mistakes, and I say to some of these people who are hands-off, like the last 30 years of the government, you know, hands-off, the market knows best. Well, where's the evidence of that? And smart governments in Scandinavia, Singapore and Taiwan understand what New Zealand First is saying. And that's why we're going hard on the basis that what we talk about to those countries makes common sense, and we want to move it here.
What New Zealand First is strongly against is asset sales. Now,
yes.
The council and the government here in Christchurch are considering with the idea of selling some of its core assets to pay for the fact that we have a $500 million blowout. We can't afford to fix the roads. And nothing is off the table now, according to Christchurch Mayor Leon Dalzell. I think they're really starting to realise that we've got a problem, we can't pay for the roads. Would you then support a partial sale of assets in Christchurch like the airport?
No.
The port?
No.
Why not?
Well, you're losing your long-term income earner, and even Treasury. Hardly a left-wing institution said that these asset sales, for example, like in energy, is going to be economically a downside, will cost the New Zealand taxpayer, will not benefit them over the period of 10 years and beyond. That's what Treasury said, and will go for Christchurch as well. Your problem is you are seriously in debt here, but the rest of this country is not so heartless not to understand it. And my party understands it. We would make up the difference to the people of Christchurch, because for the first time for 81 years, there was an earthquake of that dimension in this country, like Napier in 1931. We understand that, and the central government should be stepping up, because the level of debt you just talked about was
$500 million.
Yeah, was 300 million less than what they dished up to South Canterbury financed by failing to cap it. Do you see the irresponsibility here?
So you're suggesting there's an agenda. There's an
why
agenda,
do all these
isn't
people
there?
keep on voting National after this sort of behaviour?
So are you suggesting is there an agenda then, regardless of whether we have assets or not, from the government to push the council into saying, we've given you enough cash now, council, you better start selling things because that's it? And what is the government
Well, that is their agenda.
But what does the government have to gain by the agenda? I don't get it.
Well, because you've got a number of right-wing ideologues who had a smattering of understanding of right-wing economics, and they think that anything the ratepayer and the taxpayer owned cannot possibly be run successfully. That's what they argue. Just going to recap some history for you. When the Western financial crisis happened in 2007, 2008, because of Wall Street's greed, 51 finance companies, owned or privately, went belly up, didn't they?
That's right.
Right. When the share market crashed way back in 1987, remember Black October, of the world's worst 10, 6 were from New Zealand. Of the world's worst 4, all were from New Zealand. Compare that management compared to the state and the council management of assets in this country, and they don't match. So what we New Zealand First are saying is, stop this blind ideology that you may have learnt by reading a book from the Chicago School of Economics, and start running things practically with some common sense.
We need to take a break. I want to talk to you next about the rock star economy, which you don't believe is happening.
No.
You don't, do you?
No, I don't.
That's next. Stay with us. Lynched on CTV. Welcome back to Lynched on CTV. My guest tonight is New Zealand First Leader Winston Peters. Mr Peters, we have a housing crisis in Christchurch. The government likes to refer to it as a challenge. I don't care, it's a crisis. When you have rent for a one-bedroom crap hole at $500 a week, you know there's a problem. Labor has come out and said, don't worry, Chris, we're going to fix the problem. We're going to build 10,000 homes in as many years. They've admitted to me they'll have to go overseas, look at the Philippines to bring in the workers. I feel uncomfortable about that, not because I'm racist, but because of the quality of workmanship that may be different. We've already got these issues now in Christchurch, as Labor has suggested. So what's your take on the housing crisis in Christchurch?
Well, for a start, it's a crisis born of circumstances, and you might call it an act of God. So it's understandable. However, it's been there for more than 3 years. What have they done in the government about getting the people with the skills and the training to take up the slack of the requirement for labour and skills in the rebuild? Well, very, very little. More importantly, they're relying upon overseas labour from Ireland and the Philippines. Again, how that advantages us, I don't know. Because if you had to put the investment into training of New Zealanders and New Zealand companies to build houses, that's a direct reinvestment back into our economy, but not the way they're doing it at the moment. So let me say, there are a number of companies who could build really adequate housing in this country if the government would give them the contracts to do so. I don't believe the government is doing that.
But the reality is, though, Mr Peters, we simply don't have the population base or the tradesmen available in the first place. Is it a matter of flicking more money at the polytechs that do all sorts of weird courses for unreasonable time?
Well, we've had a long enough time to. And let me just tell you, there are tens of thousands of tradesmen called New Zealanders just offshore in Australia. What are we doing about getting them back? Our own people.
What can we do to get them back? Because they don't want to come to
Well,
Christchurch.
maybe pay them a decent wage. That's how you get them back. And maybe the government could help by ensuring that the companies employing them have a decent tax break to pay those sorts of wages. It's a two-way street.
Jerry Brownlee often says the market will sort itself out when it comes to the housing crisis in Christchurch. And to be fair, he's probably right.
Do you think Jerry Brownlee understands economics?
I'd like to think so.
No, he doesn't understand. He's got no background in economics at all. When did he ever write on economy?
Does it worry you?
What's his background? Why would he say that the market will sort these things out? Where in the world has the market sorted these things out?
Well, it hasn't at the moment, not in Christchurch, that's for sure.
But not anywhere else in the world either.
Do you believe in capping rent then? Or does that go down a dangerous path of, will that stop investors investing?
I far prefer to, because Jerry would love this sort of language, follow supply-side economics. If you supply far more housing, far more accommodation, the rents will come down.
Will they?
Yes, they will. Because people have a choice of not having to pay high rents in inadequate places.
What about opening up more land around the fringes of Christchurch?
We used to build, when we had half New Zealand's population, more houses than we built for the last 10 years per year. That's when we were a great country. Then we stopped building houses as a country, stopped having our targets, and now we've got a crisis of accommodation with tens and tens of thousands of people looking for homes in Auckland in particular and elsewhere and in Christchurch.
So what's the answer then? Give me one answer to
build
fix
houses. The state has to have a housing construction policy. Whenever the National Party gets near an election, they start dog whistling about it, don't they? But for the other 34 months, they say nothing. Other parties are as guilty of doing that as well. We have to have a state housing target.
Speaking of other parties, even parties that aren't even in Parliament at the moment, Colin Craig and the Conservative Party, I know you hate talking about this man, but he seems...
I don't mind talking about it. I've got a good sense of humour. Well, this is the 45th anniversary. Yesterday was the 45th anniversary of Man on the Moon.
Didn't get much coverage, did it?
Let me tell you this. Even the North Koreans that hate the Americans, and the old Soviet Union used to hate the Americans, they believe the Americans got a man on the moon.
All right,
but this party you journalists take seriously doesn't.
But I want to ask you that then. Why is it then that us journalists seem to be infatuated with men that aren't even in the... And I'll give you an example.
I tell you what.
Colin Craig and what's-his-face,
yes,
Kim.com.
Yes.
The reality is
Mana
that...
Deutschland, yeah, I know what you mean.
Do you reckon they stand a chance?
No, I don't think they stand a chance at all. And
but the Greens are worried because they're taking off some of the youth vote.
Media, present company accepted, are just out there indulging themselves with spurious polls and silly comments, and on election night they'll look silly all over again. But don't you do that.
I'll try and...
Make sure CTV doesn't do that in Christchurch.
CTV won't do that. But I do want to ask you about Colin Craig, though, because he said over the weekend he's taking a lot of votes from New Zealand First. Is that true?
And you asked, didn't you?
No, I just
Mr. Craig, where's your evidence?
I just heard it from News Talk CB.
Oh, yeah, but did they ask? Certainly they asked that because they're responsible journalists, aren't they? But where's your evidence for that, Mr. Craig? I mean, he told you at the last election that he was winning hands down on Rodney.
That's right.
What happened? The guy was in one of the biggest majorities in the history of Rodney, and none of you went along and said, "Now, Mr. Craig, why did you make that statement?"
He's great for a soundbite, though, Mr. Peters.
Oh, I see. Okay, so it's great for a soundbite. Here we are in a tipping point election with just over 7.5 weeks to go. We don't want soundbites now. You want common sense.
I'll give you a good common sense then for you. 21 years New Zealand First. Does it seem like 21 years as a party?
No, it's been like lightning. It's gone like lightning, really. One of the great things...
Has it really?
Yeah, it has. It's just been so fast because, we have been seriously busy and it hasn't been the easiest one, as you know. I mean, with the greatest respect to some of my friends in the media, they haven't given us the easiest ride that some parties have been given, but that's not the point. We had one thing that other parties seriously didn't have. They had millions of dollars, and they've still got millions, tossing money around like an 8-armed octopus in this campaign. But we've
like
got
a what?
8-armed octopus,
Okay, right.
Well, they got money, but a lot of it's foreign, a lot of it's coming from all sorts of people, millions of dollars, right? But what we've got is a lot of people with true grit, work hard, and they'll never be shifted by some of these civilists and other things that are profited.
So what do you got, another 21 years left in you?
Nobody's saying that Warren Buffett doesn't know what he's doing, do they?
Oh, that's true. We're out of time. Winston Peters, appreciate your time.
Thank you very much.
Thanks for joining us. And thank you for joining us tonight. Christchurch Mayor Leanne Dalzell joins me on News Talk ZB tomorrow. But from all the CTV team, good night. Lynched on CTV was proudly brought to you by Christchurch's #1 dining offer, Sequoia 88, at the Redwood Hotel, a food concept unequalled.